welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gress at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions.
Okay, so thanks, Denise. So yeah, as Denise mentioned, I'm going to talk more on how we can increase our forage productivity, more on the aspect of soil fertility. So as Denise mentioned, I am a field agronomist. So the counties that I cover specifically in Iowa are those in that Region 8 area on the map. So I cover 6 counties in kind of southeast, east central Iowa. But we have field agronomists across the state. So feel free to reach out to us if you do have any questions. So with that, we're just going to jump in here on forage production and management. And so when it comes to managing our forages, a really key aspect for successful establishment and longevity of pastures and hayfields, we really need to think about to have a really vigorous forage stand. That's going to be a combination of making sure that we have the right species out there in the field, making sure that we're addressing soil fertility. Wes talked about managing our weeds, and then especially for in more of a hay setting, harvesting that harvest management. But I'm going to really focus here today on the soil fertility aspect. So when it comes to managing soil fertility with our forages, it's really no different than if we have row crops. So for our forages really to be productive, we need to make sure that we're addressing their soil fertility needs. Some of the requirements are a little bit different than row crops. The overall concepts are not different, but some of our requirements are a little bit different. So one of the things, especially when we think about it in a pasture setting and we're out there grazing our pastures, the cattle are eating that forage, but they're also putting stuff back out there as well. So we do know that approximately 75 to 95% of the P and the K does get returned to the soil with the manure, and then about a quarter to maybe half of the nitrogen is going to get returned either in the manure or in their urine. But with that nitrogen, we do have a risk of losing some of that nitrogen that's getting returned as well. And then obviously in a hayfield, when we're harvesting and taking that forage off, we do need to think about the amount of nutrients that we're taking off with that as well. So up here on the screen, I do have a table. This is adapted from our publication PM 1688. We have a list of all of the different crops in that publication, but this is really just highlighting some of the forage species. And so I think it's really important to think about when we do harvest and remove that forage, we are removing a lot of nutrients, especially phosphorus and potassium. So just for example, if we look at that table here, that top line is showing alfalfa, or if we have an alfalfa grass mix, and per ton that we remove there, we do remove 13 pounds of P2O5, so our phosphorus, and we remove 43 pounds per ton of our K2O. So if we are doing any type of haying, we do need to think about what we're removing and then what we might need to put back on so we don't lose our productivity, especially if we keep doing this every year, year after year. So when it comes to managing our soil fertility, one of the first things we need to think about is soil sampling. And this is going to help to kind of provide a basis of, okay, what is the soil providing? And do we need to provide anything additional to help either maintain our productivity, or if we're seeing where our productivity is decreasing, is this going to help us to increase our productivity? So when it comes to soil sampling, typically we want one soil sample to represent approximately no more than 10 acres. So a lot of times in row crop production, it's not uncommon if we take soil samples to have those soil samples be more like 2.5 acre grids. I don't expect us to do that in a pasture setting, but I don't want a soil sample to represent more than 10 acres or approximately 10 acres. And I'll talk here on the next slide of how do we decide where to take those soil samples from. With each soil sample, we're going to have about 10 to 15 cores make up that soil sample. So I'm going to grab a soil core from 10 to 15 different areas within that sampling area, mix it together, and that's going to make up my soil sample. We're going to take those soil samples at about a 6-inch depth. If we're just worried about pH, we may just take 2 to 3-inch depth samples. But if we're worried and we want to get the information for the P and the K, we can use those 6-inch soil sample depths. We also want to think about where we're sampling. So if we have a really high traffic area, maybe it's where we have mineral feed or a watering area, or it's a shady spot, we either want to avoid those areas or maybe sample them differently. And then depending upon the terrain that we have in our pastures, if there's areas where we know there's no way we're actually going to be able to get any type of fertilizer applied to that part of the pasture, it's just not accessible or it's too steep, then it doesn't make sense. We don't need to sample that part of the field. Once we collect those soil samples, and this is something that you could easily do yourself, or you could potentially have it hired done, we just need to send those soil samples off to a certified soil testing lab. Iowa State no longer has our soil testing lab, but there are certified soil testing labs that we can send those samples to. So you can find a list of those certified soil testing labs by either scanning the QR code here on the screen, or you can visit that go.iastate.edu website here on the screen as well. And really with the soil sampling, what we're focusing on is what do we need for phosphorus, potassium, and lime. And when we also think about soil sampling, if we're going to do this, especially over time, we recommend taking those soil samples at a similar time of year. So that way, if I want to compare to see how do the most current samples maybe compared to what I had previously, or if we're just starting off and just taking soil samples and we want to take them again in the future, taking them about the same time of year makes it easier to compare and see, are we seeing an increase or a decrease? Are we maintaining status quo? And typically for like a pasture setting, if we can soil sample every 3 to 5 years, I'm going to be really happy. In row crop, we do it a little bit more frequently, every like 2 to 4 years or once a crop rotation. But in a pasture, I'm happy if we're even taking soil samples, and if we can do that, in every 3 to 5 years, that would be fine. Now, there's different ways that we can think about where are we gonna determine what makes up a sampling area to take our soil samples. So this is just an example of a pasture that Denise and I did a project in a couple of years ago. This pasture, it's approximately 50 acres. And there's different ways that we could sample this pasture. If we look at it, we see down the middle of it, there's kind of a long winding kind of dirt gravel lane. You can also see where there's some trees and also where there's some areas that are a little bit rockier or might fall off a little bit. So, when we think about how we're going to pull samples or determine what our sampling areas are, one way to think about is if we have paddocks already set up in our pasture, we could sample kind of by paddock. We could also pull in, or we could look at, based off of kind of management zone. So that would be kind of example like I have here. So, different areas of the pasture kind of highlighted with those orange circles there. So in this case, it kind of end up being like 6 areas that we're sampling, more so taking into account, soil type, maybe where they're grazing or what the topography of the field looks like as well. We could also pull in soil type information. So Web Soil Survey is a good resource to do that. So here's an example of the same pasture where I pulled in the soil type, which in this case, this is outlined by those yellow squiggly lines. And then the white circles are maybe where we could determine or think about where we want to take those soil samples from. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way. The nice thing with having multiple samples is it helps us to see if there's variability out there and then adjust fertility needs based off of that variability. So once we take those samples, we get them sent off to a certified lab. We're going to get those results back. So here's a copy of what that lab report might look like. There's also, if you hire it out, you might also get pretty maps of what this looks like as well. But once we get these results back, what are we going to actually do, or how do we interpret what these results mean? So a really good resource we use to help make sense of these results is the publication PM 1688, a general guide for crop nutrient and limestone recommendations in Iowa. So I have the URL here on the screen. This is a publication that you can download as a PDF for free from our extension store. Or if you'd prefer, you can purchase a hard copy as well. Or if you download the PDF, you could also print off a copy for yourself if you wanted. But inside this publication, we have different tables based off of what type of crop or forage we're looking at. And it's going to show the different soil testing categories that we have and help provide recommendations based off of research that we've done and based off of the soil testing categories on what we would need to or recommend to apply. So this is just an example of what some of those different tables look like in this publication. So table 10, this is showing recommendations for alfalfa or alfalfa grass, hay and pastures, whereas table 12 is showing it for tall, cool season, warm season perennial grasses, and then sorghum sudan, hay and pastures. So you just need to kind of look and see, depending upon what type of pasture or system that you have, we just want to make sure we're looking at the right table. So I'm going to kind of walk through here an example of how we use these tables to help interpret what our results are. Or if you are working with a retailer, you can kind of use this to see, okay, how does this compare to what they're saying versus what PM 1688 would say. So this is going back to some soil samples that we collected from a pasture here in eastern Iowa. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through that first soil sample here that I have highlighted. So with that soil sample, the test results came back at 217 parts per million for phosphorus, and the test that the lab used was the Bray P1. And then for potassium, the results came back at 272 parts per million, and they used a dry test. So the pasture that the sample was collected from, it was a tall, cool season grass. There weren't legumes out there. So we're going to use table 12 to help interpret what those results mean. So if we start off first with phosphorus, I said that the lab used a Bray P1 test. It is important to pay attention to what tests the lab used, which you can tell based off of the soil test results. You'll be able to see which tests the lab used. If you're not sure, you can reach out to one of the field agronomists. We can look at that, or we can contact the lab, or you can contact the lab to see. But depending upon the test, that can change slightly how we might interpret the results. So in this case, we had a Bray P1, and the results were 217 parts per million. So if I look at this chart here, if we go over to see the different parts per million here, we see that the 217 is way off the charts because very high is 35 parts per million plus. So in this case, if we look down here, as far as pounds to apply, it's telling us we don't need to apply anything. Probably don't need to apply anything in my lifetime in this field with how high the phosphorus is testing in this particular pasture. But that helps us to know, okay, we're good on phosphorus. That's not going to be what's decreasing our productivity. On the potassium side of things, the results came back at 272 parts per million, and they used a dry test. So if we come down here for the potassium, we see that we have the option for the dry or the field moist. Unless you specifically request field moist, most labs are automatically just going to do the dry test. But we see here with our 272 parts per million, we are also again in the very high testing category. We don't need to add any additional potassium in this case. So that's just kind of a walkthrough of how we use those tables to see, okay, do we need to apply anything? If so, what would those recommendations be? When it comes to as far as like the time of the year of when should we apply phosphorus or when should we apply potassium if it's needed, usually, especially if we're in the very low or low testing soils, we're going to want to do it when the grasses are going to be more actively growing. So especially with our cool season grasses, looking more like early in the spring or in the fall when it's cooler, and we're going to see more active growth from those grasses. The other thing we're going to use the soil test for is to look and tell us what our soil pH is. And the soil pH is really important because it can affect the availability of different nutrients in the soil, which that's what this chart on the screen here is showing. So we can see that kind of more that neutral range or between that like 6.0 to about 7 is when a lot of those nutrients are going to be more available for our crop or forages to take up. If we get more on the acidic side, we can see where some of those nutrients become less available. So the soil test might say that we're very high testing for them, but if we have a lower pH, they're just not going to be as available for our crops to take up. Same thing if we get too high on the pH side, but typically we worry more about being on the lower side for pH. For our grass pastures, or if we have like, a grass red clover kind of mix out there, our recommendation is typically going to be, we want to target pH of around 6.0. Now, if we want alfalfa, whether we have straight alfalfa or an alfalfa grass mix, we're going to want a slightly higher pH, and our target is going to be more that 6.9 or where that pink line is there on the chart. So when it comes to interpreting our soil test for pH and if we need to apply lime, the soil test results are going to give us two different pH numbers. There's going to be a pH number, and then there's going to be a BPH with that BPH is the buffer pH. So the pH we use to tell us if we need to add lime. So is it at that target pH that we want? And then the BPH, or that buffer pH, that is measuring the reserve acidity in the soil. And so it's going to tell us how much lime do we need to add to actually see an increase in or raise that pH to where we want it to be. So I often use this example or analogy to kind of explain the buffer pH. I can have a glass of water that is half full of water. I can also have a bathtub that is half full of water. It's going to take a lot more water to fill up my bathtub to make it full compared to if I have just my glass to make it full. And so that's kind of what that buffer pH is telling us, is that size. How much do we need to add to increase it? So if I have a really low buffer pH, a more acidic buffer pH, it's going to take a lot more lime to increase that pH. Whereas if I have a higher buffer pH, it's not going to take much lime or as much lime to increase that pH. So in this case here, our pH from the soil test results came back, it was 6.0, and our buffer pH was 6.8. Now for in forages or pastures, unless we're starting totally from scratch or doing a complete renovation, the depth to soil that we're looking at to neutralize is probably going to be more in the 2 to 3 inch depth versus the 6 inches, because we're not going to actually be incorporating that lime into the soil with any type of tillage. So we're going to look more at that 2 to 3 inch depth on this table here, which this is table 16 in that PM 1688 publication. The pH is going to tell us, do we need to add lime? And then we're going to look to see what the buffer pH is to see, okay, how much lime do we need to add to get to our target pH? So with this pasture, it was a tall, cool season grass pasture. So our target pH is 6. I look, my buffer pH is 6.8, and it tells me I'm good. I don't need to add any lime. Now, if say maybe I wanted to incorporate some alfalfa into this pasture, I wanted a pH of more 6.9, then I would see that I need to add either between 900 to 1,400 pounds of effective calcium carbonate equivalent per acre to raise that pH to the target 6.9. So one thing with lime, just like when we think about even some of our other fertilizer products, whether it's potash or MAP or DAP, it's not going to be 100% of the actual thing. So we know we need between 900 to 1,400 pounds of the effective calcium carbonate equivalent. Then we need to know how much lime we need to actually add. We need to know where that lime is coming from. And so if you're working with a retailer, they can help to provide this information, or you can also go to the Department of Ag's Ag Limestone Quarry Certification Report. If you know which quarry your lime is coming from, you can look up and see, okay, what is the ECE of that particular product? And then we can calculate how much of that product do we need. So just for an example here, I went on and I got a quarry here in eastern Iowa, and the ECCE of that lime was 978 pounds per ton. And so if we need 900 to 1,400 pounds per acre of that particular product, I'm going to need between 0.92 tons to 1.4 tons of lime per acre. So that's kind of some quick going through the math of how we calculate how much product would we actually need. I want to talk a little bit about nitrogen, especially because when we're talking grass, we know that grasses are going to respond to nitrogen. And if a lot is good, or if a little is good, a lot is better, right? Well, it's going to depend a little bit on, can we actually use that forage? So I think especially early in the spring when our cool season grasses are growing really well, if we can't keep up or get to all that grass, then I would say a lot is not necessarily better. We want to make sure that we're able to use that forage efficiently as well. We also need to think about what is our stocking rate, and then also, are we going to apply all of our nitrogen in one sitting, or are we going to do a split application? Maybe we're going to do some earlier in the spring, and then we're going to come back when we get closer to fall and do some for that more of fall growth as well. There's different types of nitrogen sources that we could use. And I know urea is by far the most common one. But one of the concerns that we have with urea, especially if we're going to apply it to a pasture and then it's dry and it doesn't rain, one of our concerns there is that we can have volatilization losses. And so we're not actually seeing that urea get into the soil and provide us that nitrogen for our pastures. So this is just some research looking at the potential loss of nitrogen with some different nitrogen sources in pastures. And it's looking at loss if it didn't get incorporated in with rain 3 days, 7 days, 11 days, and 15 days after it was applied. And so just looking at urea, there was no inhibitor or anything applied to that urea. 3 days after it was applied, not worked in, we lost about 14.5% of the nitrogen that was applied. 15 days, it was over 50% that was lost. Whereas we can see with ammonium sulfate, we're losing less than a percent, a lot more stable. And then we can see, if we do use urea with some type of inhibitor, that's going to help to decrease the amount of nitrogen that gets lost. So if you're thinking about, is it worth it or not? Especially if, the rain chances maybe look questionable and we're wanting to put that urea on, I would say it's definitely worth it. It's going to buy us a little bit more time before we start to see more of that nitrogen if it doesn't get worked in where we could see some losses. So urea is definitely probably the most cost effective and the most common type of nitrogen source that I see applied to pastures. And people, if we need to control some weeds out there, we can put that herbicide on their urea as well, or places will do that. And so you can kind of kill two birds with one stone there. But ammonium sulfate, if that's an option, that can be a really good option, especially if we're worried about the potential for volatilization loss. It is a little bit more expensive though than the urea. So there's that kind of balancing act there. The other thing, when we think about our nitrogen needs for our forages, is we really want to take into consideration how many legumes or the percent of legumes out in our pastures. So if we have where the composition is less than a third legume, we're probably going to need some additional nitrogen to help that grass productivity. If we have where it's that field is made up of more than a third, with it being legumes out there, we probably don't need any additional nitrogen. Those legumes are going to help to provide what we need. So knowing what species we have out in our pastures can be helpful to know, okay, do we need some or do we not need some? So just some general recommendations as far as like nitrogen needs in pastures and forages. With our cool season grasses, so talking like brome grass, orchard, tall fescue, timothy, Kentucky bluegrass, we can either apply it all up front in the spring, or we could look at doing a split application in the spring and then coming back late summer or early fall. In total, we're looking at, between 100 to maybe 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. If we're working with warm seasons, we're going to apply this a little bit later. So more like, May into June. And we're going to be looking at, 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre is our kind of our rough recommendation. One caveat I want to add, especially if we have tall fescue, is we do really want to be careful on how much nitrogen we're applying. We don't want to over fertilize with nitrogen if we have tall fescue, because that can increase the risk for fescue toxicosis. So a lot of people who have tall fescue do a good job of managing this, but this is just something to be aware of. And I will say I'm seeing fescue, normally it's more of people think of it as a southern Iowa thing, but I am seeing it moving up in the state. And I know Denise has seen it up in northern Iowa as well. So we touched on, phosphorus, potassium, lime, nitrogen. Now, obviously, there are other nutrients that our crops need. So you can see the different macronutrients, secondary nutrients, and micronutrients that our crops need to grow. And the only other one that we might think of, especially in like a forage setting, where we might need to add some, is with sulfur. Some of the more recent work we've done looking at sulfur is, if we see areas that are maybe a little bit more yellow, just not growing as well as other parts, we may actually have a sulfur deficiency and need sulfur. I know I see people using more sulfur in row crop production compared to historically, and part of that is we don't get our free sulfur like we used to with the acid rain. So that might be one, if you're noticing areas, especially in alfalfa, that we have seen a response with sulfur. Unfortunately, sulfur is like nitrogen, and that it's really hard to soil test for sulfur. We do have some tissue tests that we can use, especially like in alfalfa, to see, okay, do we need to add anything? And we have some recommendations based off of that. But we don't have a great correlation for sulfur with soil tests because it's, again, a lot like nitrogen. It's harder to get that information. But if we think about, I get a lot of questions sometimes about like the micronutrients, and I like to think of soil fertility like climbing a ladder. I need to address what my pH is, make sure I'm getting enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on. Then I'm going to look at sulfur. If I'm not taking care of those other things, if I just, oh, I'm going to put on some micronutrients, I'm going to fall off that ladder. I can't jump to that top rung and expect to be successful. So we have to focus on those other ones first, and then maybe we could look at some of the micronutrients. We're just very fortunate here in Iowa that we have higher organic matter soils that supply typically what we need for those micronutrients. So we don't have great recommendations based off of tissue tests or soil tests to be like consistently, if you see this, this is what you need to apply. So make sure that we're taking care of those other big things first. And then if we want to, take it really up a notch, we could start to look at some of those other things. But I would encourage you to, test it in different areas and see, do you even see a response or not? So with that, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time on soil fertility, but I'm happy to answer any questions.